the scene. He's got the voice that's mean, asking those questions that you never seen. He's got that fire, burning bright and clean. Andrew Keen making waves, break the routine on the Keen on show. He brings the heat, asking the minds, digging deep till they bleed. No sugar-coated truths, no lies to deceive. Andrew Keen, the master of the interview beat. He's got the knowledge, he's got the flair, challenging ideas with a fearless stare. With every question, he's uncovering what's there. Andrew Keen, a truth seeker, he's aware.
Hello, everybody. It is Tuesday, September the 17th, 2024. My guest, Marietje Schaake, who doesn't need much of an introduction, a former parliamentarian in the European Parliament, and now a very influential critic of big tech. She has her own institute at Stanford University. A new book, The Tech Coup: How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. Marietje is joining us from Haarlem in the Netherlands. Marietje, there is an avalanche of books about how the internet is killing our world. Your book is part of that. Tell me more about your own narrative. Were you an early believer? Did you believe in the early days, in the 90s or the early 2000s, that the internet could make the world a better place?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. And I still think that the internet has brought incredible benefits and connection and, creativity, curiosity, empowerment of people. The problem is the unchecked and excessive power grab by tech companies that have really sort of captured the internet for their own profits. And that is hurting democracy. So I think it's important to make a distinction between the internet and the World Wide Web and the big tech companies that operate on top of it and indeed claim it as if it's their own.
Your book is called The Coup. That's a strong title. Are you suggesting that big Silicon Valley companies, of course, like Google and Facebook and Amazon and Microsoft, have essentially pulled off a coup, that they're the ones now in power, sort of a Leninist-style coup, as Lenin seized the Russian government in 1917?
Well, I talk about the power grab by an ecosystem of tech companies, big and well-known ones, but also smaller ones. And I think we should think about the tech coup as an illegitimate transfer of power out of the hands of democratically elected and accountable leaders. And so it's the sum of the parts. And as much as the tech coup is a criticism of the Silicon Valley leaders and their companies taking so much decision-making power and governance power into their own hands, they are, of course, taking the room and the space that has been left by the lack of leadership and putting up of guardrails by democratic governments. So this is as much a criticism of their abdication of their responsibilities as it is a criticism of the harm to democracy of this transfer of power.
Marietje, your claim in the tech coup is pretty dramatic. It goes beyond, I think, anyone who's been on this show, and we've had many critics. Explain what you mean. It sounds very dramatic. It sounds like a sort of headline one might find in the Daily Inquirer or something. What exactly has happened? Can you give me some examples? Because it still feels, I live in America, I travel to Europe a lot, it still feels as if democracy exists, may not be ideal, but nonetheless, everyone can vote. We all know what's happening in the world. What exactly has happened?
Well, we see that there are a number of ways in which tech companies are asserting their power and taking over key decision-making positions from democratic governments. So one area where this is very clear is in the realm of war and conflict in the digital sphere. When we look at Ukraine, many people will recall that 2.5 years ago, Russia started a war of aggression by tanks rolling into the country, rockets falling on buildings, hospitals, schools, and marketplaces. But if we look in the digital domain, in the cyber realm, Russia has been attacking Ukraine's civilian infrastructure for much longer. And it's doing so in a legal gray zone, which doesn't provide the kind of clarity about when the sovereignty of a country has been breached, when international law and norms have been violated, and when consequences should kick in. The same can be said for espionage, which is, generally considered below the threshold of conflict, but where in the digital realm there have been espionage activities that have created enormous collateral damage across digital infrastructures, which those infrastructures, by the way, are built, scanned for risk, and secured by companies. So we see an entire domain around very sensitive protections of national security, protections of national infrastructure, building of national infrastructure, deciding on offensive measures, even across borders, where companies are really the ones in charge, and where a lot of information that we get about what kind of activities have happened also depends on whether companies are willing to share on their blogs, for example, about what it is they've seen in terms of incoming offensive activities against US and other targets or Ukrainian targets. So this kind of transfer of insights, of agency, and the legal gray zone that surrounds it is not contributing to strengthening the rule of law. And I think that that's a problem.
It's a very dramatic claim, Mariette. I want to dig into this a little bit. I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. Russia has always used technology to pursue its own ends. It did it in the first, what some people call the first digital world war, when it attacked Estonia many years ago, at the beginning of the century. If we had someone from one of the big tech companies on the show, I'm guessing they would say that they have nothing to do with this, that Russia is using technology, drone technology or surveillance technology illegally to pursue its own interests. And it's got nothing to do with them. It's certainly got nothing to do with Silicon Valley. It sounds to me, and perhaps clarify if I'm wrong, but it sounds to me as if you're suggesting that these big tech companies should be in bed with the Western powers and the Ukraine in its war against Russia. What exactly are you saying? How is Silicon Valley participating in the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
Well, what I'm saying is that there's been too much left to fate and the hope that indeed those Western-based technology companies would choose the side of the US government, or the side of a coalition in the case of Ukraine, or the side of an international rules-based order when there is a conflict between two states, as there is now between Russia that has illegally invaded Ukraine. So when we look at the front lines, there's a dependence on satellite connectivity provided by Elon Musk's Starlink. There is open source investigations through other satellite collected data. There is intelligence gathering through, for example, looking at Telegram groups, or looking at traffic data on Google, which in turn has decided not to make that information public anymore because it might inadvertently reveal troop movement. I'm not saying that these companies are playing into the hand of Russia. I'm just saying that by and large, there is no clear framework on the part of democracies to make sure that companies are actually supporting international law, the rules-based order, democracy in any conflict. So it may be a pretty clear case in the case of Ukraine, where a lot of companies have come out on the side of Ukraine, and they would probably even advertise in their PR that they are helping the good cause, and that they are in the front lines defending Ukraine and democracy. We hear such comments made by Alex Karp of Palantir, for example. We see companies like Clearview offering their services, quote unquote, by offering facial recognition technologies. We first saw Elon Musk offering satellite internet connectivity, and then putting it on the line when he pushed the US government to pay it, not providing it on Crimea because he had a different geopolitical opinion about the status of Crimea. So that kind of dependence is a fragility, if you ask me.
There's an echo, though, Marietje, here of the Cold War. There were lots of debates in the 1950s within America about how American corporations should be helping America in its fight for democracy against the old Soviet Union. Now it's called Russia. Shouldn't these companies have independence? I mean, if we had someone from Apple on the show, for example, they would say, well, we can't open our phones. Even if we wanted to, we can't. And the whole point of our technology and our platform is to guarantee privacy and freedom of expression. That's what democracy is about, not getting into bed with the US or Western security services in the war against Putin in the Ukraine. I take your point on Karp and Palantir, particularly. Musk is also a rather unsavory character. But when you talk about saving democracy from Silicon Valley, that's a much bigger accusation than simply a few cowboys like Musk and Alex Karp.
Yes, it is. So I do think that indeed companies have played oftentimes dubious but roles in many historical conflicts. They've also been forced to make a choice. If we look at apartheid in South Africa, for example, there were boycotts and there were pushes for companies to do the right thing. I do think that if we are serious about the stakes of some of these wars, like the one in Ukraine, then we should put boundaries up against companies. That could take the form of sanctions, which it has, that actually limits the activities of companies. But I also think that there's just an enormous dependence on the technologies provided for all kinds of services, tax authorities or hospitals or schools, or intelligence services. Basically, the reliance on tech companies to provide for the needs that we have. Think about cybersecurity, for example, which, it's just not working. There are breaches every day. Even the most sensitive information ends up being compromised. And yet there's been this push to digitize, which, has privatized a lot of the key insights and functions that used to be much more in the public domain without the necessary transparency and oversight. So I think companies are naturally or often playing the role that they are given the room to play. Therefore, I believe we need to spell out much more clearly what that room looks like if we believe that there should be checks and balances, that there should be independent oversight over what powerful actors are doing, and that there should be accountability in the case of negligence or in the case of bad actors playing their roles. So it is really about making sure that this power does not become a risk in the system, and that it is clad in sufficient accountability and oversight mechanisms.
Some people might be listening to this, Mariette, and thinking, this all sounds like the euphemisms of a former European bureaucrat who's trying to seize power back from the powers that be in Silicon Valley. There's a long history of this. Of course, your former colleague, Marietje Schaake, I've written about her, met her, very remarkable woman, has been on the front lines of this in terms of the EU's struggle with Silicon Valley. It seems as if this clash, if it's the right word, historical clash between states and large tech companies is beginning to reach a kind of climax, I guess. There's the clash between the Brazilian government and X, the attempt by the French government to arrest the founder, the CEO of Telegram. In historical terms, standing back, we know your position on this. Will the 2020s be remembered as the moment when the real conflict in the world is between big tech and traditional states?
I think we're reaching that point indeed, yes.
And you know where you stand. You stand on the side of states.
Not all states. I stand on the side of democracy and the rule of law, and that is a huge distinction. I think we need to really be clear about that. And oftentimes there is this this false dichotomy between all states on the one hand and all companies on the other hand. But first of all, companies, even if they talk a lot about wanting to defend freedoms and protecting democracy, they often don't act that way. So I think it's also important to make a distinction between the nice things that are said by corporate leaders and then the behavior that they display. You recently mentioned in your comments Apple and their support for privacy. That same company, Apple, as well as Google, took out of its app store, upon pressure from the Kremlin, the opposition's app days before the elections. Navalny's political party had developed an app, his anti-corruption movement, that would indicate which politician, which political party had the best chance to stand against Putin's candidate in any district in Russia. And this app was taken out of the App Store because the Kremlin pressured Apple and Google to do so. Not a single Western politician made a statement criticizing this. This just quietly happened. And so we have to also look at the acts of these companies. The same could be said with Facebook in Myanmar. Lots of talk about how freedom of expression is a great thing, but when it comes to calling for genocide and you don't do anything, then there is a complicity there, and it is very, very harmful. So let's also look at what the companies do and not just look at what they say.
Don't some of the companies, though, haven't some of these companies done better than others? You bring up Google. Sergey Brin, one of the co-founders of Google, was very outspoken in pushing Google to retreat, if that's the right word, from China. You haven't talked about China yet. It's a complicated situation. Apple makes its smartphones in China, but many large tech companies have a very ambivalent relations with China. Is there a model for a large tech company who is, at least in your view, standing up for democracy?
Well, it's great that companies at different points in time have done the right thing, but that is not a policy that we can lean on. So, I welcome every...
Well, but answer my question. I take your point, but are there models? Are there companies that have done better than others?
Of course, there are companies that have done better.
Who are they?
Well, I think Signal is doing an incredible job with really prioritizing the privacy and strong encryption and showing that there can be a different model. I think that
Marietje, just jumping in here. I mean, this is another subject. It's a big subject, but some people might suggest that networks like Signal actually empower the dark web, child pornography, the dealing in arms, and all other sorts of illegal activities. So this is a complex situation, isn't it? You don't want tech companies to empower the dark web.
No, I don't. I think that everybody should take his or her responsibility to, within a clear rule of law framework, cooperate. Nobody should be above the law, not a big tech company, not a criminal, and not a criminal using the services of a big tech company.
So, sorry, I interrupted you on Signal. What is Signal doing that distinguishes it from other big tech companies?
Well, I think it's acting much more in the public interest. It takes a principled stance, very focused on its technology. It is not harvesting data in the same way that bigger messaging companies or services are. It is not part of this whole surveillance capitalism model that is so toxic for the information ecosystem. So it's just a different kind of animal making different choices about its role in society, the use of technology, and also the limits in the balance between profit and product.
Who owns Signal and how do they make money?
I'm not an expert.
Well, but all companies exist to make money. So what's their business model? I mean, you bring them up as the model, but and you bring up surveillance capitalism in its advertising model, and many people have made that argument. But how has Signal reinvented itself to make money and not kill democracy or freedom or privacy?
People like myself actually contribute to their services. I know that they have bigger donors, but I don't know the details of their business model. I'm sorry.
So it's a kind of Wikipedia style model, for better or worse. It relies on the generosity of its donors. And it's probably a bit murky. I mean, who knows if the Russians or the Chinese or the Iranians or Al-Qaeda or some other dark force is financing it. It doesn't seem to be particularly transparent or accountable. At least these large tech companies, we know where their money comes from.
Do we?
Don't we? Are you suggesting we don't, that we don't know where Google or Facebook or Apple's money comes from? I mean, they're public companies. They're relatively transparent, aren't they?
Yeah, I think there's part is transparent, but we've also seen information about, for example, Saudi investors in X coming out reluctantly, other kinds of clusters of investors trying to hide the fact that they are investors. So there's no systemic transparency in who investors are. So it's good that there is in some parts. It's not necessarily the case in others.
But Marietje, isn't that just a feature of global capitalism? It's true of all companies, whether it's a big tech company, a big pharma company, a soft drinks company. There are problems with transparency in large corporations. This isn't just a feature of the tech world.
Well, to that I would say 2 wrongs or 5 wrongs don't make a right. If there's a systemic lack of transparency in the corporate world, then we have a problem with whoever is not being transparent. And I do agree, and I write that in the tech coup as well, that some of the ways in which intellectual property rights protection, for example, trade secrecy works, has gotten out of proportion. So it's a kind of protection that any company can enjoy. The recipe of Coca-Cola is a secret so that nobody else makes the same kind of drink. But from being a factor towards fair competition, this lack of transparency has become kind of a impenetrable shield to hide any kind of information. And I think when a sector or a set of services like new technologies grow to the impact that they have in society, some companies grow to the size that they have, and the kinds of technologies that we see, like AI, for example, are unpredictable in ways that we haven't seen before. We cannot just say, oh, we have laws that have been on the books for 50 years. We're just going to leave it this way. And that's the way it has to be. Governance has to be agile to the new challenges that new developments present us with. And I don't think it's hard to find ways in which AI is one example, but also still we're dealing with a lot of challenges around social media, the use of data, targeting, algorithmic adjustments, discrimination and bias. We can still see a lot of harms that are just not properly addressed yet. And the longer we wait in doing so, the harder it will become, is one of the points that I make, because if there is a lack of insight and oversight in the public interest, then it's harder to have a fact-based and evidence-based debate about what kind of public policies we need. And that sort of spiral of no access to information or lack of public understanding, having a right kind of approach through policy really is reinforcing itself.
So you talk about agility in government. How, in your view, can government, can the state, the 21st century state, be made more agile to be able to compete and stand up with these increasingly powerful multinational big tech companies?
Well, a variety of ways. A lot of people will probably think about regulation, but there's more. To a lot of tech companies, governments are the biggest, if not a major customer. So being much more deliberate about what governments want to see for their societies, for the public, in the purchases that they make is a way to go. Less lock-ins, more transparency, more accountability. Also, when governments outsource functions to tech companies, they, meaning the government, should be held to account. They shouldn't be able to sort of offload their responsibility in behaving according to the law. For example, I think we should have what I call in the tech coup a public accountability extension. So if a government engages a tech company to perform functions that are governmental services or law enforcement, then there should be the same kind of accountability, whether it is through the tech company or directly operated by the government. I would like to see much more independent information reaching politicians and decision makers with experts that work in parliaments and city councils, There are just a lot of ways, pragmatic and easy to operate, much more comprehensive and more challenging to implement, that I offer in the book.
Is the problem that you said they're easy to implement? If they were that easy, presumably they would have already been implemented. Is the problem with them not being implemented so far that big tech is resistant to it, or government is just so bureaucratic and reactionary that it hasn't thought of these things?
Well, I think we see a couple of trends. On the one hand, there's a bit of incident response that prevents a more systemic approach to the solutions as well. There's been reluctance to adjust regulations and oversight to the digital age, particularly in the US, where a hands-off approach, a big belief in market forces has just been dominant, and where, even if there's a growing set of important antitrust cases, antitrust is still an economic policy instrument and economically driven law. Where what I'm suggesting is to be much more direct at tackling the harms from the outsized power to democracy. So yes, there's been a reluctance. I also think there's been incident response, and I think.
What does that mean, incident response?
Well, the fact that we're still really, really very much stuck in what social media causes in terms of harms without zooming out to the bigger picture. So there have been so many incidents, from cybersecurity breaches to Cambridge Analytica to concerns about disinformation during COVID, that it's very easy for policymakers to run after the latest revelation or scandal or challenge that they see. What I've tried to do in the book is, with the experience of having been a lawmaker for 10 years, zoom out a little bit more and look at more systemic ways in which the democratically elected and accountable leaders can step in, measures that lead to more transparency, more oversight, empowering regulators, for example, and governments playing a more assertive role towards strengthening the rule of law vis-a-vis tech.
Yeah, and the issue of antitrust, it's the cover story of Harper's this week, The Antitrust Revolution, Liberal Democracy's Last Stand Against Big Tech, by Barry Lynn. He's been on the show. He's going to come on the show. He's probably been reading your book, Marietje. Some people might be listening to this and scratching their head and thinking, what about competitiveness and wealth? Mario Draghi, one of your former colleagues, I guess, within the European government, has been very explicit in the economic crisis in Europe. He recently said that Europe faces a choice between exit paralysis or integration. He's been very outspoken on the need for massive investment in European innovation and technology. Martin Wolf just ran an interesting piece in the FT about Draghi trying to save Europe from itself. Some people might be listening to this, Marietje, and thinking, this woman wants to impose bureaucracy on innovation. America is a dynamic economy. The wealth in this country is increasingly larger than that in Europe. Europe is controlled by a bureaucracy, an anti-innovation regime. How would you respond to that?
Well, let me try to be clear about the different parts in your question. What Mario Draghi is saying is we need more integration in Europe, which I wholeheartedly agree with. Less fragmentation between countries and the laws that they have, more of a level playing field, which is sort of the age-old mission of the European Union, but a mission not yet completed. That the fact that the EU needs more innovation and more investments towards innovation, I absolutely agree with. I also think that the idea that regulations will always lead to more innovation, don't work. So we need to make sure that there's the kind of investment, that there are hurdles removed for entrepreneurs who have a challenge to scale up in Europe, because access to capital is not as easy and not as risk-oriented as it is in Silicon Valley. So there are a lot of very important points that he makes that I wholeheartedly agree with. This whole idea that the EU is not innovative in terms of its potential, or that there's a bureaucracy trying to stop that, I don't agree with. I think the reasons for lagging on the part of the EU when it comes to innovation are much more in the fragmentation between countries, the fact that it doesn't, for all intents and purposes, act as a market, and it's great that there will be a focus on how to solve that problem.
Do you think that some governments need to be more aggressive? Robert Reich recently wrote an interesting piece in The Guardian suggesting that Elon Musk is out of control. I don't think anyone would debate that, even Musk himself. And he believes that there needs to at least exist the threat of arresting him unless he can be controlled. Is there a need to be more hands-on in terms of handcuffs with guys like Musk?
Well,
would you like, for example, in the EU, for there to be an arrest warrant for Musk, like for Durov, the Telegram guy, so that if he chose to set foot in the EU, he would be arrested?
If Musk violates laws in terms of compliance with crime fighting, I'm sure that there will be an arrest warrant against him, but it's not up to me, and it shouldn't be up to me. It's up to law enforcement agencies. But the difference is, if you don't have a law, then you cannot enforce the law. And I think that what we're seeing vis-a-vis large parts of our digital lives, the laws are lagging behind. And I don't want to see arbitrary arrests of people. I want the rule of law to reign, and that means that there should be a foundation for any kind of such activities by law enforcement, and very clear rights protections of the suspects as well. So my whole approach is not about picking out winners or losers. It's about saying we need minimum thresholds to protect our open societies from any kind of mischief. But this book is about the outsized power of tech companies. And, you know, Elon Musk does present more examples than I could have wished for when I started writing this book about how things can go wrong. You know, the fact that he is really stirring unrest. He is suggesting that Kamala Harris will steal the election. There's no foundation for that. You know, he has said that there might be civil war in the United Kingdom. These are very strong words. Now, are they ground for arrest? Experts would have to talk to that point. I don't think so. But do we want to make sure that there are clarities about the limits to freedom of expression, that there is also a focus on other rights that need to be protected? There's been so much focus on the freedom of expression, which of course is a cherished freedom in open societies that we should really protect well, but it doesn't mean that it's limitless. It doesn't mean that, you know, incitement to hatred or those kinds of expressions are always within the legal sphere. It doesn't mean that non-discrimination is tolerated. It doesn't mean that violations of antitrust are tolerated. So we simply cannot be content when the answer to any criticism is yes, but freedom of expression. And that seems to be what Elon Musk is saying. And as I mentioned earlier on the show, it's not what he's doing, because at the same time he is suing Media Matters because, well, apparently he doesn't like their expressions. You know what I mean? There's a risk of not reading into the momentum that we're in, the very principal issues that are at stake here. It tends to become a bit of a show of characters, which I think would be a missed opportunity of learning from this moment in time.
Marietje, is there anything different, though, between Musk as essentially a media baron, media tech baron, very wealthy man, and his attempt to change the world and make it reflect what he cares about, his values, his interests, and what William Randolph Hearst did at the beginning of the 20th century in terms of shaping American policy, foreign policy, even sometimes inspiring wars of his own, American invasions overseas, or Rupert Murdoch and the power of News Corps in the 20th century? Why is someone like Musk different? He has a lot of power, he has a lot of weight to throw around, and that's exactly what he's doing.
I don't know if it's as much about why he's different. Didn't we also learn from those examples that you mentioned that not putting up guardrails leads to bad outcomes? I mean, we've also seen private mercenary armies fighting in the Middle East for their own objectives. I mean, that is certainly not the direction that I would like to see the role of technology in our societies going. So what is different about Musk, I guess, is that he has multiple companies and is also willing to, you know, to leverage one company towards the objectives of the other. So he's, you know, playing on different chess boards. But the combination of the power through his companies, the wealth that he has, and the geopolitical agenda that he has, I mean, even if that happened 100 years ago, I do think they're unique in the moment that we live in now. And he's playing with fire.
He certainly is. He's very close, of course, to Donald Trump, very unashamedly close. If Trump wins the election in November and maybe makes Trump Musk head of some new innovation center, how does that change your argument? You've written this book talking about how to save democracy from Silicon Valley. What happens if, some people argue, American democracy is in crisis? Most of Silicon Valley, of course, I'm not sure whether you use that literally or as a metaphor for big tech, but most of big tech, almost all of big tech, is in the United States. Some people would argue that tech can resist this, and there are people in Silicon Valley, very powerful billionaires like Reid Hoffman, who have been very explicit in supporting democracy. So, in terms of your argument about the tech coup, what happens if Trump wins the election and begins, as he's warned, to begin to dismantle democracy?
Well, that would be a disaster, of course, and that would.
Well, that goes without saying. But what could you imagine happening? How would Silicon Valley respond? I'm guessing that most people in Silicon Valley would be very unhappy.
Oh, I'm sure they would be very unhappy. They would suffer from his immigration policies. They would suffer from the lack of trust in the United States on the global stage. They would probably suffer from all kinds of trade barriers that Trump would put up. You know, it's hard to predict what will happen. But when I hear about Musk being offered a role on a sort of, I guess it was an efficiency or efficiency of government kind of council, then I immediately worry about what the label efficiency will hide in terms of a sort of purge that could happen within government, right? I mean, we've seen Donald Trump as a very vindictive man who has already announced that he wants to hold people accountable for. But
he hasn't been shy, Marietje, on that. He's been very explicit. And there's an election coming up, lots of debate about whether or not it's free. But if he does indeed win the election legitimately, then why is that undemocratic? He has every right to appoint Musk to any panel or commission or job he wants. Why is that against democracy?
Well, if he's going to take anti-democratic measures, then just because he's democratically elected doesn't make them legitimate. I mean, democracy is about much more than elections. And we have all too many experiences in Europe, but also in the rest of the world, that I truly hope Americans will look at to see that a fairly elected leader can very quickly and very successfully dismantle the democracy that brought him to power or her to power.
Are you thinking of the 1930s? You talk about these examples in Europe. Are you thinking about the 1930s in Germany? Are you comparing Trump and Hitler?
No, I was actually thinking about Viktor Orban, for example, who did get elected. He used to be a liberal.
Yeah, who Trump spoke very highly of in the debate.
Yeah, another book that might be interesting to feature on your show is Autocracy Inc. by Anne Applebaum.
Yeah, Anne's
really
been on the show. I
recommend that speaks about these relationships between authoritarian leaders around the world, and also really criticizes the fact that democracies have not done enough to draw a principled line. And I really think that maybe one of the key lessons of this moment is that we are not appreciating how fragile democracy is, how quickly things can turn around, and how willing some people are to just gamble it all away. And I see that dynamic in the United States right now, where it's unbelievable to me how much support these anti-democratic ideas of Donald Trump
but Trump wouldn't argue they're anti-democratic. Some people might be watching this, especially on the right, and thinking this woman's just articulating sour grapes. That anytime, it's the old Cold War argument, anytime you don't like what the other person's saying, you accuse them of being an autocrat or an anti-democrat.
Sure, I'm sure that's what they will say.
And are they wrong?
So I'm talking about the very, very separation of powers. I'm talking about the core principles of checks and balances in the US system, where it's just not respecting of those principles when the executive takes too much power into their own hands. And so it actually, I hope that your listeners to the right side of the center will not care about what I have to say, but will look at what experts have said about it and will trust those. And I worry that they won't. It's not important what I have to say about it. It's important what Donald Trump does and what it will mean for the democracy of Americans and for the future of the world. And so I think a lot is at stake in the next elections. And just because people might vote, it doesn't make anything that the future president does democratic and therefore legitimate.
Marietje, we've had some conversations touching on this already. If Trump's elected and, for example, he starts rounding up what he calls illegal immigrants, sending them home or wherever I don't know about home, they don't have a home, rounding them up, putting them in camps or whatever. Do you think that, you mentioned Orban in Hungary, do you think that there are legitimate reasons to resist these types of what Anne Applebaum calls these new autocracies, whether they're in Hungary, perhaps the United States? Progressives tend to be very sympathetic to resisting Putin and breaking, quote unquote, the law in Russia. Should we have the right in Hungary or the United States to do the same thing?
Well, once a leader starts to dismantle institutions, starts to stifle the freedom of the press, starts to choke off academic freedom, starts to target immigrants, minorities, women in the case of the United States. Can you believe what is happening in terms of restricting the rights of women that have been fought for so many decades? Of course, people should resist.
What about the TikTok case? I'm curious as to your take on this. TikTok supposedly is on the brink of being banned in court at the moment. What's your stand on TikTok? Supposedly a Chinese-owned company. Are TikTok part of the tech coup? The subtitle of your book is How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley. Is it how to save democracy from Chinese social media companies like TikTok too?
Of course, because their business model is the same. It harvests a lot of data with big questions about where that data will go. There are disinformation problems. Recent interesting study by ISD about Nazi content thriving on TikTok despite efforts to moderate content. So of course there are big problems with a platform like TikTok, and in particular because so many young people use it, and there are questions about young people.
But I mean, what's the worst? There are lots of accusations that the Chinese government is somehow accessing TikTok information. There's no proof of that, and who knows? I mean, what's the value of the data on TikTok about what the memes that kids put up? I mean, where's the value? I don't see why that's so. Why governments would have any interest in that.
Well, obviously there are many more uses of TikTok than memes that kids put up. In fact, we look at politicians who are embracing it. I find that quite ironic. There's a debate about banning it, but campaigns on both sides are still using it to persuade voters. So apparently people also use TikTok to learn about politics, to learn about society, and as we hinted at earlier in this conversation, the vast collection of data about people, knowing about their preferences, their likes, their friends, their themes of interest, can and has been targeted for political advertising too, and can also be.
But should that be illegal, Marietje? I mean, that's the nature of things. Advertising has always been in the business of trying to figure people out and reach them, to message them, to sell them their products or services.
Yes, I think there should be limits on the way in which people are targeted and on the basis of what information advertisers are allowed to target people. I think the fact that it's happening in ways that people themselves don't really have a choice about, and that really gets to more and more intimate parts of who we are as people, is beginning to challenge notions of free choice. We're also seeing developments in neurotech, where technology and the human body are, merging more and more. So the intimacy of data that can be discerned about people is far-reaching, and the way that can be weaponized for all kinds of nefarious goals is concerning enough that yes, limitations, if not bans, are definitely legitimate to discuss.
Finally, you said earlier that regulation wasn't the only answer, although a lot of the things you're saying sound rather sort of aggressively regulatory, for better or worse. You're also, in the book, you support what's called the Declaration for the Future of the Internet. It seems to be a kind of more supported by the US Department of State. What exactly is this, and how can we come up with perhaps international arrangements, digital versions almost of the UN, that may offer an alternative to just hardcore regulation of banning things?
Yes. So what I argue in the tech coup is that democratic countries, in order to be effective on the global stage where democracy is under pressure, they should work together better. I don't think the Declaration of Freedom for the Internet or the future of the Internet is the solution. I think the coalition of countries that have signed on are indicative of what a set of like-minded countries can look like, but I would urge them to work together much more strategically. In fact, if you look at the differences between the EU and the US, you'll see that there are too often lots of differences that are magnified between democratic blocs and democratic states, to the detriment of their collective ability to have impact. And so I would hope that we will see more effective collaboration between democracies, and there are a variety of initiatives that could be a sort of motor block for such alliances that could more strategically develop tech policy in sync.
And finally, you're working from the inside. You're involved with the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford. Stanford, of course, being ground zero for Silicon Valley. It was where Google was founded, many other big tech companies. What are you doing at Stanford, at the Cyber Policy Center, for trying to change the world, to undo what you call the tech coup? And are you seeing a shift in the zeitgeist? We've had a number of Stanford academics on the show who have changed their minds, I think, about the role of technology. Are things changing in Silicon Valley, in the heart of Silicon Valley, where you work at Stanford?
Well, what I do is I work on tech policy from a research, from an education, and from a capacity building point of view. So we develop courses for politicians and policymakers. I teach to students courses like AI and the Rule of Law, where I try to bring together notions of, where technology could fit in the rule of law, existing laws, how would they apply, new laws, what would we need? So it's a very dynamic field to work on with students. And if I look at my students, where I see a growing appetite for this intersection between technology and democracy as a field for them to be active in, they are very idealistic and very concerned about discrimination at the hands of tech, disinformation, geopolitical tensions. But there's also just the pragmatism of the paycheck after college, the ability to do the most interesting research within companies. So I do think that broadly at Stanford as an institution, among colleagues that are professors or among students, there is a sense of, it wasn't just a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that we were creating here. There's work around educating people more broadly, not just as computer scientists, to be more responsible when they go into developing tech. But there's also the pool of market forces that remains very powerful. So the idea of bringing talent into more public interest facing roles is still very much an uphill battle, even if I do think that the young generation is aware, idealistic, and that people at Stanford are thinking about how to course correct what has clearly gone off rails.
Well, Marietje Schaake, I've butchered your name. I apologize, but I've done the best I can. You are an important voice. Your new book, The Tech Coup, How to Save Democracy from Silicon Valley, brings a lot of the zeitgeist together. Thank you so much, Marietje. It's a real honor to have you on the show. And I'll have to come down to Stanford and we'll do a real-time live interview with you, maybe later in the year or early next year. Best of luck with the book. And thank you so much for appearing on the Keenon Show.
Thank you.